the funny thing about the 9-dash line, it is literally 9 dashes on a map. There are no coordinates to the 9-dash line. You don't really know exactly where it starts and stops.
Hello and welcome to Perspectives with Nilo, a regular podcast bringing you news and views from around the world. I'm your host, Neil O'Sullivan. Recording and producing a podcast is relatively straightforward. Getting it heard these days is a whole different story. There's so much choice, it's virtually impossible to stand out. And so I'm really grateful that you chose to listen to this podcast. Listeners like you motivate us to keep going. And it would really help a lot if you could share it with your friends and family or give us a like on social media to help discovery. Earlier in August, we reported on China's maritime aggression against the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea. In the intervening months, this aggression has increased in frequency and severity and expanded further afield to include Vietnam and Japan. Ray Powell is the Director of SeaLight, a project of the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation at Stanford University in California. In late October, I sat down with him to hear his insights on what's been going on in the Indo-Pacific. Ray, you're very welcome to the podcast. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Thanks, Neil. It was great.
Can I ask you first about SeaLight? You're the Director of SeaLight. What is SeaLight and what's its mission?
Well, actually, so SeaLight came out of a project started 2 years ago here at Stanford to try to figure out the South China Sea security dilemma, which was essentially that China's expansionism there had been going on for decades, and the countries that were being most affected seemed to have no real defense against it because it all happened in what we tend to call the gray zone. These are, minor aggressions that don't seem to quite get anyone's attention, and so China was able to keep expanding deeper and deeper into their neighbors' waters with very little consequence.
And we've seen a lot of mention of these things recently. It seems like, there's an increasing frequency and increasing severity of clashes between Chinese Coast Guard and Philippines vessels in the West Philippine Sea. We've also seen incidents between China and Vietnam, between China and Japan, and to a lesser extent between China and Malaysia. In fact, I heard somebody comment recently that the only coast China doesn't seem to be guarding is their own. And so can you tell us a little bit about this activity? I know SeaLight has been reporting on it. What's been going on, and maybe a little bit on the background as well.
Sure. So China believes now, sort of at a national level, that its national mythology, its national narrative, is that it earns a much larger maritime and territorial plot than it has received through the years, and this is in large part because it was subjected to 100 years of humiliation from the early to mid 1800s until 1949, when of course they became the People's Republic of China. And now is the time for them to come into what is rightfully theirs. And unfortunately for its neighbors, that includes a large amount of their maritime space and in some cases territorial space if we're talking about their land borders. So that's where all of this is coming from, is China finds itself with both the will and the capability to begin pushing the bounds of all of those claims, which includes almost all of the South China Sea.
I know if we go back maybe in a decade or so, there was a standoff at Scarborough Shoal between the Philippines and China in 2012.
Yes.
And out of that, the Philippines took a case to the International Court of Arbitration. What happened with that? So
the Philippines was successful. They had an extremely compelling and cogent case to bring that China had violated the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is actually one of the most stunningly successful international legal structures ever set up. It was under negotiation for decades. China signed it in 1996, but China sort of has made itself a large cutout and said, well, of course we can't apply it here. And what the convention says is that there are limits to the amount of water that you can claim to be yours. And China, again, has said, well, yes, but those limits don't apply to these places in which we have, quote, historic rights. And sort of the bizarre part of all of that is that is exactly the kind of problem that the convention was built to prevent. But China believes that as a great power, it should be able to cut that out and say, by some means, we are going to keep it from applying within this place that we claim.
And they talk about their 9-dash line.
Yes.
Does that have any legal or historical basis?
No. In fact, it really is barely a thing, right? So the funny thing about the 9-dash line, it is literally 9 dashes on a map, right? So there are no coordinates to the 9-dash line. You don't really know exactly where it starts and stops, and the fact that there are dashes instead of a solid line kind of indicates that. And China kind of thrives in the ambiguity. And so when they refer to these things, they often will just say, China has historic rights to the islands of the South China Sea and relevant waters or adjacent waters, which is even more ambiguous than the 9-dash line, but that just sort of allows them to say, well, this, of course, falls under our historic rights. It's very difficult to argue against because you're not really sure where that starts and stops.
Okay, very ambiguous.
Yes.
And recently, in defense of their claim, they seem to be getting more and more aggressive. I mean, we see water cannon,
yes.
lasers,
yes.
ramming, all of these, boarding boats, not just Philippine boats, but also Vietnamese boats.
Yes.
Is there why do you think now have they gotten more aggressive all of a sudden?
Yeah, I'd say two reasons. One is that they can, right? They believe that they now have the maritime capability to be able to enforce the 9-dash line claim. And to a large extent, they do, right? They have a vast Coast Guard, a thing called the Maritime militia, which are essentially reinforced fishing boats that don't fish, but instead act with the Coast Guard to push other countries' boats into places where they don't think they are out of places they don't think they should be, and of course the Navy. But also because the plucky little Philippines in early 2023 began to push back, and China, I believe, has decided that an example must be made that this is fruitless, that countries that push back are going to suffer for it, and so your best road forward if you're a country on the periphery is to acquiesce.
And it's very interesting how, you mentioned the Philippines there, it's very interesting how they have used the media to show China's actions firsthand. This has been very effective.
Well, so we at SeaLight have started to refer, we actually wrote a paper on this earlier this year, to this Philippine initiative as something we call assertive transparency. And the reason we call it transparency is obvious, but the assertive part is that they actually pushed out with cameras, with embedded reporters to document assertively Chinese aggressions within what they call the West Philippine Sea. And I think this is actually a pretty unique approach to a maritime gray zone problem, because if a gray zone operator thrives in the gray zone because the zone is gray, what would happen if you turned on the lights? And the Philippines has kind of pushed the bounds of that question. Now, they have certainly taken on a lot of risk in doing that. They, essentially the wrath of a very, very large neighbor. On the other hand, I think they've gained several very important benefits. One is they have built up their own national resilience against this activity, by which I mean now they are increasing their maritime security budgets. Now they are getting their legislators, their elected representatives behind the effort to push back. Now they are seeing civil society rise up. And so you're seeing all of these things that indicate that they're no longer okay with just knuckling under and doing whatever China says. And the second thing is they've just received a ton of international support, including financial support, material support from not just their U.S. ally, which has been a lot, but also countries like Canada and France and Germany and, just Australia and Japan in a huge way. So this is actually really, really necessary if the Philippines is going to stand a chance in this long-term struggle.
And as you said, they have, they're coming up against quite a force of China's extended and upgraded and expanded forces, right? On your website, on the SeaLight website, you say that China has by far the world's most expansive and aggressive maritime grey zone programs. So can you tell us a little bit about what that means? I mean, are we talking about just their large and well-equipped Coast Guard that are maybe overly aggressive at times, or does it go beyond that?
Well, it certainly goes beyond that. And it's not, so it's the Coast Guard, which is not a Coast Guard in quite the way we think of Coast Guards in the West. So it falls under what's called the People's Armed Police. And so they are enforcing what not just their entitlements or their coast, if you will, but their claims. And so they build extremely large ships, so a standard U.S. national security cutter is going to be about 4,500 tons. The largest China Coast Guard ship comes in at 12,000 tons. So they're going to be large. There's going to be a lot of them. They're going to be equipped with kinds of things that are used for essentially, if you will, maritime riot control, right? They're going to have reinforced hulls. They're going to have very powerful water cannons. And then they're augmented by this strange animal that we call the Maritime militia. And this actually is sort of a generic term meaning two different forces. One is a professional militia, which sometimes even wears uniforms. They have their ships never fish. They get actively involved in these assertions, and sometimes will ram and bump and block and all of those the other countries' ships along with the Coast Guard. The other part is what we call the Spratly backbone vessels, and those basically go and sit in places that China claims, and they often will tie themselves together in an activity that we often call rafting. They raft themselves together, and they will sit there for weeks, sometimes months on end, as a passive assertion that China owns this. And so all of this falls well outside of what we're used to in Western democracies, and we've been having a really hard as a group trying to come up with effective responses to it.
And I've also read, I think, on your website that a lot of these just the Spratly backbone fishing vessels are subsidized by the Chinese Communist Party. They get fuel subsidies and other subsidies.
Yep. So that's one of the really remarkable things. So there's two different ways to fund a maritime militia, right? And so one way is to directly pay for the people. And on the professional militia side, that's what we see. And the other is to give a fishing company money to do what you want them to do. And so the deal is, if you send your ship down to the Spratly archipelago, where there aren't maybe that many fish to go get, and instead of, and then we will give you a fuel subsidy to go, quote, fish there. But we know you're not going to fish because it will be more cost effective because of actually the sparseness of the fishing environment to just sit in a particular place and collect the fuel subsidy, which is quite generous. So if you stay there for 280 days a year, then you can have your annual fuel subsidy, and we will give your company a whole bunch of money. And this works out great for the fishing companies because they don't have to use fuel. They can collect the money. They don't have to really put many people on the boats because you're just going to sit. And so it's a really kind of devilishly brilliant scheme.
Also wanted to talk to you a little bit about Taiwan, because we've also seen China conduct ongoing drills around Taiwan, which they've codenamed Joint Sword 2024, the most recent one being on October 14th. I know China has been executing its grey warfare against Taiwan on almost a daily basis for some time. Are we seeing anything different happening in these latest drills?
Yeah, I'd say the visible participation of the China Coast Guard has been remarkable. And of course, many people noted that it did appear to be very much to be sort of a rehearsal of how China might carry out a blockade of Taiwan. And so the very public and visible participation of the China Coast Guard raised a lot of eyebrows. That the China Coast Guard would participate in what we would think of as a military operation. But of course, in China's view, since Taiwan already belongs to China in their mind, having the Coast Guard, well, we're just guarding our own coast, right? We are, and essentially what it looks like they're doing is saying this is what we're doing is practicing how we would carry out a quarantine of the island, and so you'd want your Coast Guard out there to be taking control of commercial ships that we don't think should be there, conducting, quote, law enforcement activities. And so, I think that was one of the things that really sort of stood out to me.
With all this aggression that China is executing against its neighbours, we talked about Taiwan there, the Philippines, Japan, Vietnam. China has quite a few border disputes with its neighbours. How are these targeted countries responding? I mean, are they building alliances? Are they bolstering defences? What kind of reactions are happening to this aggression?
Yeah, so it depends. There are some countries that are very much trying to curry China's favour and hoping that sort of this will pass, that they will be able to sort of run under the radar when countries like the Philippines and Japan are more visible and getting more of the aggression. Malaysia comes to mind. Malaysia has been very vocal about saying that we don't have a problem with China. There's no issue here. The fact that they put their patrol Coast Guard ships into our exclusive economic zone and sort of run by our gas operations isn't really a problem. We can manage this. Whereas, say, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Japan, of course, are beginning to start to draw together in more visible ways. Now, some of these are all different, right? So, the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, these are countries with U.S. alliance already, and so it's the path for them to work with the U.S., for example, is very easy.
This is the Squad, is it they call it?
Well, so the Squad actually was U.S., Japan, Australia, and the Philippines, and so that was sort of a term that came from differentiating themselves from the Quad, which substitutes out the Philippines for India. But the Squad was sort of a military instantiation, I guess, and of course it's an informal term, but it's very popular in the Philippines. And so we've seen some Squad exercises, but we've also seen sort of other exercises that are multilateral in nature that involve other countries. Canada, France come to mind. So that's happening, and I think you're going to see more of these sort of multilateral sails. We call the Philippines will refer to them as joint patrols. Maritime cooperation activities, I think, is the term of art, and so you're seeing more of this now. Words, phrases like Asian NATO, as the Japanese Prime Minister recently used, that's very provocative, and I don't see a lot of people sort of jumping on that bandwagon at this point. But there may actually be, sort of below the surface, more substance to the idea that you're going to see increased amounts of cooperation with these countries.
There was a recent ASEAN summit in Laos. It was reported that Southeast Asian leaders stepped up pressure on China to respect international law, but Chinese Premier Li Qiang was defiant as he blamed external forces for interfering in regional affairs. But China must not be happy, I would imagine, with all these alliances between these different countries in the region. But are they an effective deterrent, you think? Or can they be?
Yeah, so there's a couple of parts to that. One is ASEAN, and if you are, say, the Philippines, you're very frustrated with ASEAN because ASEAN has actually been very muted in its response. And, of course, there has been an ongoing negotiation for over 2 decades over developing a South China Sea code of conduct with China that ASEAN has led and has really got kind of nowhere. I mean, really hasn't gone anywhere. And China has no interest in it ever sort of seeing the light of day. And so the negotiations in some way serve China's purpose to say, yeah, we're working on this. And, of course, while they continue to expand their de facto control. Now, what I will say is that China's own aggression has made kind of what China least wants, which is a growing consensus among more like-minded nations. So not ASEAN specifically, but again, you're talking about the U.S. allies. You're talking about, to some degree, Vietnam, of course, which doesn't do alliances, but has started to sort of come up with some cooperation agreements with places like the Philippines. It'll be interesting to see where the new president of Indonesia, as we're having this discussion right now, there is a China Coast Guard ship harassing an Indonesian oil and gas exploration effort in the North Natuna Sea within Indonesia's claimed and legitimate exclusive economic zone. And a couple of days ago, they claimed to have sort of pushed the China Coast Guard ship out of that area, but it's come back. And this is within days of the inauguration of President Prabowo. President Prabowo, of course, is a more internationally oriented, more defense oriented president than, say, Widodo was, Joko Widodo. So it'll be interesting to see how he responds to this.
Okay. You mentioned the possible code of conduct for the South China Sea there. If China doesn't adhere to international court rulings, can they be trusted, basically, to agree to any code of conduct?
No. So that's the easy answer. Essentially, China agreed to something called the 2002 Declaration on the Conduct of the Parties of the South China Sea in 2002, right? And so this is with ASEAN. And this said all kinds of things that weren't supposed to happen that China is actively doing. And so the rationale between a code of conduct is that, well, this will be something that's, quote, enforceable, that will keep the countries accountable for aggression. Well, who's going to enforce it, right? And what would China possibly agree to that would not have China as the enforcer? China claims the entire 9-dash line, and their objective is to enforce that claim. So anything that comes out of a code of conduct would, in some ways, if it were to have an enforcer other than China or some kind of collaborative enforcement or something, would undermine that claim. And so, honestly, if it ever does get done, and I don't think it will, but if it ever did get done, the most likely outcome would be that China would use it as a way to nullify UNCLOS, the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. They'd say, hey, we've got this code of conduct we've all agreed to. The UN thing no longer means anything for the South China Sea because everyone has agreed to this new thing, and whatever the new thing is will probably be much worse for those countries than the UN version.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about, and I think you touched on it earlier, was the activity of China's deep sea research ships and their encroachment into neighbouring countries' exclusive economic zones. The most recent report I saw was one of these ships patrolling in Japan's EEZ near Okinawa. My understanding is that under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, permission needs to be sought from a country to enter its EEZ for this kind of activity, but China never appears to seek permission. What are your observations on what's behind this kind of activity? So
the activity can actually have multiple benefits for the state that's doing it, right? So what UNCLOS essentially says is that in order to do essentially a commercial or economic resource-oriented research of another country, of a country's EEZ, essentially is under the control of that country, right? Now, military activities don't really get covered under UNCLOS, so this is part of the gray zone that China kind of exploits, because what's actually military and what's not. So why would China want to know what's on the seafloor? Well, it could be they want to know what hydrocarbons are under the seafloor. They might want to know where submarines can operate and where it might be dangerous. So they might want to map the seafloor. They might be interested in undersea cables that traverse the seafloor. And sometimes they just want to send a message to that country that we don't recognize your claim to these waters. We can do this because these are actually our waters, and this is an assertion of our sovereignty.
In Europe, we've seen Russian ships operate in a suspicious manner in Ireland's EEZ, for example, and we suspect they're surveying many of those transatlantic cables, the cables you mentioned, that pass through Ireland's waters. Analysts are saying that Russia is sending a signal that they know where the cables are and that they have the equipment to disrupt if required. We've also seen a situation where a Chinese ship travelling through the Gulf of Finland in October 2023 dragged its anchor for over 100 miles and broke several cables and gas pipelines. And also, of course, Taiwanese authorities have accused China of cutting cables to its outlying islands of Matsu. It's interesting to see these authoritarian regimes undertake similar tactics. Do you think there's any collaboration going on between what has been called the CRINCs, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, or is it all just, a case of them wanting to cause disruption in the West, and in other words, the West is their common enemy?
I think there's some limited collaboration. I don't know that it gets as detailed as, okay, I'm going to, dear Vladimir Putin, I'm going to send my ship to go drag an anchor. Love, Xi Jinping. I don't know that it's that specific, but I do think that their interests are aligned, and they, on the broader effort to. This is, in a lot of ways, this kind of activity serves as a deterrent, right? A deterrent to the West, a deterrent to NATO, a deterrent to countries that they don't want to. They want to sort of coerce into acquiescence to their revisionist agenda. They want to revise the world order because they don't think that the way that it came up under post-World War II was favorable to their countries. So they want a new world order that they are in control of. And to the extent that they can sort of encourage other countries to be quiet while this happens, and because you really wouldn't want your cable to be disrupted, that serves their purpose.
And just overall, I mean, on the whole South China Sea question, some people will say, "Oh, that's none of our business. It's far away. It's over there." But I presume it's got importance for every country on the planet. What are some of the things people should know about that?
Well, I mean, I think let's put this in this context. Let's think about, so from a European perspective, let's think about the invasion of Ukraine, right? Why do European countries, care about the invasion of Ukraine? Is it because everyone is concerned about the Ukrainian people? Well, sort of, sure, why not? But I think in a deeper way, in a more personal way, in a more national interest way for a country like Ireland or any other European country, do we want to make it fine for a country to violate another country's borders in a military fashion, right? Because if it's okay for Ukraine, is it then okay for Moldova? Is it then okay for another? So then let's take this to the South China Sea. If it is okay for one country, a large, powerful country, to rewrite the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, one of the most successful certainly the most successful maritime regime the world has ever seen in terms of keeping what we call a rules-based order. If one country can kind of, give it the back of their hand, then how long before everything else starts to break down and every country says, I just need to take what's mine before somebody else takes it, right? So I think that's the greater danger when we think of the reason we all talk about a rules-based order is because it protects us from things like this.
With the U.S. presidential election around the corner, do you think a change of administration in Washington will result in a change of foreign policy as regards the Indo-Pacific?
Sure. I mean, everyone does, and whether it be Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, obviously Donald Trump would be more of a change than Kamala Harris, likely. They have different foreign policy impulses. Donald Trump is known to be less interested, sort of, in at least the public support of allies than, say, the Biden or Harris camp would be. And yet, at the same time, I would say in some ways the previous Trump administration did several very important things that needed to happen. And one of those being the clarification of, for example, U.S. commitment to the Philippine alliance as it applies to the West Philippine Sea, and really recharacterizing the China problem as one of competition, whereas for years and years and years we pursued kind of almost a delusional hope that China would eventually sort of come over to our side and agree that the rules-based order was good and maybe even we could give a democracy a try. So those things were important to happen. So I think a lot depends on whoever is elected puts into their administration, because those often tend to be the people who really have a lot of the most effect on the foreign policy of the United States.
Okay. Well, Ray, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you for sharing your insights with us.
It's been great, Neil. Thanks a lot.
That's Ray Powell, who is the Director of SeaLight at the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation at Stanford University. My sincere thanks to Ray for sharing his valuable insights with us on Perspectives with Nilo. Since our interview in late October, Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. signed into law 2 new maritime acts on November 8th, which outline the waters and territories that fall within Manila's jurisdiction. These acts are entitled the Maritime Zones Act and the Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act, and according to President Marcos, they emphasize the importance of the Philippines' maritime and archipelagic identity and aligned Philippines' domestic law with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea to uphold the rules-based international order. On November 10th, just 2 days after the Philippines' announcement, Beijing released a new map establishing what it calls its territorial sea baselines adjacent to Huanyan Dao, China's name for Scarborough Shoal, outlining its control over this area, which lies within Manila's exclusive economic zone. According to Chinese state media outlet The Global Times, China has also ramped up the presence of its large Coast Guard vessels in the region, which it says are capable of longer patrols and stricter Chinese law enforcement. As you heard in our interview, China's actions in the South China Sea, as well as these recent announcements, further demonstrate that the Chinese Communist Party does not adhere to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or recognise the 2016 ruling of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which denied Beijing's claims to this area. If you'd like to find out more about these latest developments or any of the topics discussed in this episode, including China's maritime militia and what Beijing is doing to ratchet up its surveillance in the South China Sea, we've placed additional information in the Dive Deeper section of our blog at pwnilo.com. There you'll also find links to our social media, and we'd really appreciate it if you could show your support for this podcast in the form of a like, follow or subscribe. It would really mean a lot. But that's where we leave it for the moment. As always, thank you for listening, and until the next time, bye for now.